It is Friday. It's the 25th of July. You're watching ARIRANG Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gon-young. It seems that the cause of the death of fugitive Sewol-ho ferry owner Yoo Byung-eun will remain a mystery. Korea's National Forensic Service says the body was far too decomposed for them to determine what caused him to die. In a nationally televised press briefing earlier this morning, the director of the agency said that they failed to find whether Yoo had died of disease or he had been strangled to death, as there was too little evidence left on his body. The agency, which had been running tests on the corpse since receiving it on Tuesday, did manage to rule out the possibility that Yoo had died from drugs or being poisoned. The state forensic agency also reaffirmed that the body was in fact that of the fugitive ferry owner amid growing public suspicions that the body might not be his. Yoo, who disappeared shortly after the Sewol-ho ferry disaster, was found dead last month in an orchid in southwestern Korea. Prime Minister Chung Won, who promised the nation earlier this month to root out corruption after April's ferry disaster, has launched a special task force with that very goal in mind. 35 officials from government ministries and agencies, including the Justice Ministry, the Prosecutor's Office, and the State Tax Agency, have been commissioned to determine the state of corruption in both the public and private sectors, find the causes, and come up with countermeasures. Now, civic groups and the public will also be encouraged to take part in that campaign. The Prime Minister said anyone convicted of corruption should not only face severe punishment, but be forced to cough up a greater amount than the gains made from their illegal activities. Before voters head to the polls for Korea's largest ever by-elections next Wednesday, a two-day early voting has begun today. The polls opened at 6 a.m. this morning, beginning the race that has greater significance coming off local elections back in June where no party could claim victory. Now, this could also serve as a litmus test of the public sentiment over how the government managed and its countermeasures after the ferry disaster. Our Connie Kim reports.
2 days of early voting for the July 30th by-elections has begun. Those that cast ballots today and tomorrow will help determine the winners in Korea's largest ever by-elections, where 15 parliamentary seats are up for grabs. 6 of the vacant seats are in Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province, and analysts say winning the upper hand in those races may very well determine who won the greater election. And according to the last opinion poll results released on Wednesday, the ruling Saenuri Party is in the pole position. In Seoul's Dongjak-bi constituency, considered a barometer of public sentiment in the capital, the ruling party candidate is in the lead. However, there's a lot of road between now and next Wednesday. 2 opposition candidates bowed out of their respective races on Thursday to circle the wagons around the liberal candidate. The field has narrowed in the Dongjak-bi race, where at last check, the ruling party candidate Na Kyung-won had an overwhelming lead. Candidate Ki Dong-min of the main opposition party has dropped out and thrown his support behind the Justice Party candidate No Hae-chan in hopes of boosting the opposition's chance of winning. The Justice Party candidate in the Suwon-di constituency of Gyeonggi-do province also dropped his candidacy on Thursday, making it largely a 2-horse race between the ruling party's Im Tae-hee and the main opposition's Park Kwang-won. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
Now, at the nation's top office, President Park Geun-hye, during talks with the visiting governor of Tokyo earlier this Friday, asked him to help Korea and Japan improve their strained ties by sharing correct historical perspectives. During talks with Governor Yoichi Masuzoe, who is on a 3-day trip aimed at bettering bilateral ties, President Park expressed regret about the inappropriate remarks some Japanese politicians have made over historical matters. Now, she specifically referred to the unsettled issue of Korean women forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military during World War II. She said it was a matter about universal human rights that demanded attention. Friday's meeting was President Park's first with a Japanese politician since her inauguration last year. And a UN panel is urging Japan to provide a public apology and compensation to the victims of its wartime system of sex slavery. The call comes as 2 elderly victims continue their mission in the United States to raise awareness about the horrors they faced. Our Park Ji-won reports.
2 victims of Japan's wartime system of sexual slavery visited the city of Glendale in California this week. It's where a monument dedicated to them and the thousands of other victims, a bronze statue of a young girl dressed in traditional Korean clothing, is set up.
Please help us, the victims, receive an apology before we all die.
Lee Ok-sun says she was abducted by Japanese soldiers when she was only 15 and sent to a military brothel. To this day, the Japanese government denies its military operated the brothels, despite a huge amount of evidence that shows the military did. The 2 women, now in their late 80s, spoke out against some Japanese Americans and Japanese officials who want the statue removed.
They're saying really inhumane things.
Both women will stay in the U.S. for another couple of weeks. They will travel to Virginia and New Jersey and to other monuments set up in memory of all those who suffered under Japan's cruel system of sexual slavery. Meanwhile, a UN panel is urging Japan to provide a public apology and compensation to the victims of its wartime sex slave victims before it's too late. The UN Human Rights Committee said Thursday, after reviewing the records of several countries, it's concerned about the re-victimization of the former sex slavery victims. The panel criticized the Japanese government for continuously denying its responsibility and even defaming the victims, rather than taking the necessary steps to help them. The committee, made up of 18 independent experts, also noted that every compensation claim brought by victims has been dismissed, and every call to ask for independent investigation on the sex slavery has been rejected in Japan. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Relations between the U.S. and Russia are at their lowest 7 years over the crisis in Ukraine, but there is another potential flashpoint developing right here in Northeast Asia. It involves Washington's plan to deploy an advanced missile defense system in South Korea, and Russia is not happy about it. But as our Shin Se-min reports, the United States says the missile defense system will not target Russia.
The U.S. will press ahead with plans to deploy a high-altitude anti-ballistic missile defense system in South Korea to defend against North Korea's continuous missile threats. The U.S. government on Thursday dismissed Russia's concerns that the deployment of the Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Battery, or THAAD, could trigger an arms race in Northeast Asia and make it more difficult to resolve issues. Russia's foreign ministry said the plan will inevitably have a negative impact on the region. Responding to that, the U.S. State Department stressed the defense system is not aimed at Russia. It added the U.S. is committed to missile defense cooperation with Moscow, which will eventually enhance the security of NATO and Russia. The top commander for U.S. forces in Korea asked the Pentagon in June to deploy THAAD to Korea.
Study, but there's consideration being taken in order to consider THAAD being deployed here in Korea. It was a U.S. initiative. In fact, I recommended it as the commander. With North Korea's evolving threat, we obviously continuously look at ways that we can improve the defense of South Korea.
In May, the Wall Street Journal reported that Washington had conducted a site survey for possible deployment locations for the THAAD system, but no final decision had been made. THAAD, a key part of the U.S. missile defense system, can intercept enemy forces' mid-range ballistic missiles in mid-air. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
In developing news, authorities have tracked down the wreckage of the Algerian passenger plane that crashed in southern Mali on Thursday. There are no signs of survivors. Connie Lee reports.
A plane that went missing early Thursday has been found. The wreckage of Air Algeria Flight 5017 has been spotted in Mali, according to officials.
The team has confirmed it has seen the remains of the plane, totally burned out and scattered on the ground. Sadly, the team saw no one on site. It saw no survivors.
It is possible that some parts of the aircraft were seen by locals in dune areas, near the village of Bosi in Mali. All this information will be confirmed after inquiries.
It was supposed to be a 4-hour overnight flight from Ouagadougou to Algiers, Algeria. But the flight, carrying 116 people on board, including French and Spanish nationals, lost radar contact just 50 minutes after takeoff, and now found crashed in Mali. Bad weather is being suspected as a cause. The flight had asked to change its route before losing contact because of a storm. The Air Algeria crash is the third plane disaster in a week. Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was brought down by a surface-to-air missile in Ukraine 1 week ago. And Taiwan's TransAsia Flight 222 crashed amid inclement weather on Wednesday. The death toll from all three crashes exceeds 400. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
Korea's consumer sentiment has taken 2 steps backward. The index that measures the overall economic outlook of consumers remained fastened at the same level recorded in the weeks immediately following the Sewol-ho ferry disaster. This despite an improvement 1 month earlier. Well, officials say consumer sentiment is being affected by the central bank's recent downgrade of its economic outlook for this year. For details, let's go over to our Hwang Ji-hye.
The Korean government is putting forth its best efforts to shore up economic sentiment, but so far those efforts are not bearing fruit. The Bank of Korea said Friday that the nation's consumer sentiment index stood at 105 in July, down 2 points from a month earlier. The figure had rebounded in June, suggesting that Korean consumers might be returning to their spending habits, which changed after April's ferry tragedy. The index hovered at around the 108 level in the first 4 months of this year, but dropped to 105 in May following the disaster. The figure returned to that level this month, and experts say that reflects the nation's still sluggish domestic demand. The monthly index is a gauge of the overall economic outlook of consumers, their living conditions, and future spending plans. A reading over 100 means optimists outnumber pessimists. A recent poll by Nielsen showed that Korea's consumer sentiment is near the bottom among 60 countries worldwide. The figures cast a cloud over President Park's new economic team and their attempts to pull the economy out of a low-growth rut by boosting domestic demand. While announcing plans to pump money into the economy in the second half of this year, Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan also pledged to map out the budget for next year in an expansionary manner. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
And more weight is held that the Bank of Korea will lower the country's interest rate as early as next month to support the government's stimulus plan amid sluggish growth rate increase during the April to June period. Our Kim Ji-yeon explains.
There's growing speculation the Bank of Korea will cut its interest rate in the latter half of this year, perhaps as early as next month. The government is reportedly pressuring the central bank to lower the rate, which has been kept at 2.5% for 14 straight months, in order to boost its expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. The nation's new economic team, led by Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan, announced on Thursday a $40 billion stimulus plan to spur growth by inducing spending and promoting corporate activity. The government request for a rate cut comes partly because it's too late to increase the supplementary budget, which could have been used to raise capital for the stimulus plan. The speculation of a rate cut is also being fueled by recent economic figures. The central bank announced Thursday that the economic growth rate in the second quarter inched up by a mere 0.6% from the previous quarter, lower than previous estimates. Those that support a rate cut say the move will induce domestic consumption, which was attributed as the main reason reason for the lack of growth from April to June. The plan is to reduce the amount of debt repayments, thus increasing the spending power of households. But some experts say cutting the interest rate is a double-edged sword that would actually increase household debt in the longer term and ultimately constrain domestic demand, since the policy would open the door for households to spend more despite their growing debt.
The stimulus plan can only be successful when it's combined with a monetary policy, such as an interest rate cut. However, cutting the interest rate could also worsen household debt.
The Bank of Korea's next rate-setting meeting is scheduled for August 14th. Kim Jeong, ARIRANG News.
Korea's trade surplus in the automobile sector shrank in the second quarter as imports made up ground on exports. The Korea Customs Service says outgoing shipments of automobiles increased by 2.8% in the April to June period on year to $11.6 billion, while imports shot up more than 58% to $1.9 billion. Customs authorities attribute the significant bump in imports to growing demand for economic small passenger vehicles. Korea's second largest automaker, Kia Motors, said Friday that its second quarter operating profits plunged by 31.7% on year, citing unfavorable exchange rates that offset gains in the total number of cars sold. Now, for our viewers around the world, what's the first word that comes to mind when you think of Korea? Well, according to a recent survey I've got here conducted on 6,000 people from 17 countries upon the request of Korea's foreign ministry, the most common response was technology. Now, that came as a bit of a surprise to me. I was expecting, the Korean wave to top the list. Samsung was next on the list, followed by War and Psy's hit song Gangnam Style. And perhaps most shocking, more than 30% of those surveys said they found it hard to differentiate between South and North Korea. Well, 52% of respondents in Egypt fell in that category. Meanwhile, more than half of those who answered the survey said they would like to see Korea act as a bridge between advanced and emerging economies throughout the world. And that may be the case because the Korean government has released a list of the country's most competitive enterprises in the field of planning and design. And the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy designated 18 SMEs as K-Brain Powers, which refers to top companies that create added value with their strategic planning and innovative ideas. Among those selected is software company Midas IT, which has the largest global market share in the industry of engineering design software for structural analysis. The ministry also announced its plan to invest $5 million to help those top selected brain companies in their research and development. It also earmarked an additional $600,000 for recruitment of talented workforce from abroad. The ministry will also heighten the nation's industry structure and support a total of 300 companies by 2018. Well, Korea's finance ministry on Thursday announced measures to boost the economy, including changes to the tax code intended to discourage companies from hoarding cash. Well, that's in an effort to address the country's exceptionally low dividend yields and rising wealth inequality. Let's take an in-depth look for this and more. We are joined live in the studio by Dr. Lee Sang-min, Professor of Finance at Hanyang University. Professor Lee, welcome to the program.
My pleasure.
Now, President Park's new economic team unveiled a very long list of measures in the form of a stimulus package yesterday. And of course, the government's injection of $40 billion that made headlines, but also included in the stimulus is a change in the tax code aimed at unlocking billions of dollars that these corporations have in cash reserves. Analysts, of course, have been very concerned that big corporations were hoarding cash and they weren't making enough investments in the domestic economy, because if they had, this could have spurred the Korean economy. Let's cut to the chase. Now, is this going to work?
People are concerned with whether the package is working, but I think that's not the issue, because as you told us, the Deputy Prime Minister is saying that he is continue the expansionary, the macroeconomic policy until the consumer sentiment recovers, which means if the 40 billion US dollars is not enough to combat the current situation, he's going to inject more to revive the sluggish economy. And turning to the second point you have raised, we have to pay attention situation where the corporation is getting more wealthier. However, the household is getting poorer.
Right.
So we have to do something to alleviate this situation. As you know, I am the professor of finance. I'm teaching the corporate finance. The dividend is important topic. According to textbook, if the corporation have not good investment opportunities, it is optimal to pay out the earnings to the shareholders so that they can make the best use of the money. Therefore, I think the government is taking the right direction to revive the domestic the demand.
Well, the measures, in fact, drew a skeptical response. I mean, there were mixed responses. I think most economists had welcomed the stimulus package, but there were some skeptics from the Federation of Korean Industries. Of course, this is a lobbying group that represents a bigger, huge conglomerates here in Korea. And their argument is that bigger dividends from companies with high foreign ownership will only benefit foreign shareholders. And the measures would, in fact, reduce domestic investment and encourage companies to move their facilities overseas. How much of this do you agree with?
Just to evaluate the criticism from the FIA, we have to correctly understand what taxation on the retained earnings. And first, we have to understand the government would not, just impose a tax on the whole retained earnings. Just they're going to impose tax on the cash surplus. So cash surplus is only the 20% of retained earnings. And the second one is government would not tax the past or the current retained earnings. They're going to tax only the future, the cash surplus. On top of that, the corporations which will pay higher wages than threshold will be granted tax incentive. So therefore, I don't think the FDKI criticism is valid. And one more thing I want to add is the FKI is so narrow-minded that that they only pay attention to their own interest. Therefore, that they should have the wider open-minded to revive our whole economy.
Right, so putting aside other individual benefits for the greater cause of reviving the entire economy. Now, also included in this package were mortgage loans. So, ways to revive the sluggish housing market that we have here in Korea right now. And the loan-to-value, LTV, and debt-to-income, DTI ratios were readjusted in a way that, it would encourage more people to make transactions, housing transactions. What's your assessment of that point?
Now, just previously, the debt to value ratio is higher in the banking sector than the non-banking sector by 10% point. So now, therefore, people have to depend on the non-banking sector to borrow money. Now, just we have the same ratio regardless of banking sector or non-banking sector, which means people can switch the loan from non-banking sector to the banking sector which means that they can pay less interest rate payment. Therefore, they can have more capacity to spend, which is a good point. But maybe people are worried about, by the hiring the ratio, people might borrow more, just for those people who has been constrained by lower LTV. But therefore, we have to pay attention to that situation. Maybe in that means, I think, the corporation, the financial institutions pay more attention to the borrowers who are to speculate on the housing prices.
Right, but because, if you address the housing problem, then we cannot but neglect the, record high household debt levels that we've been seeing in the Korean economy these days. How do they plan on addressing that point, the, snowballing household debt?
Yeah, that's why what I'm saying is that, there are two effects by relaxation LTV. One is a positive effect and a switching effect. Another one is maybe, the borrowers who have been constrained by low LTV. Now the LTV has relaxed, therefore they can borrow more. Therefore, the financial institutions should pay more attention and take more cautionary measures to prevent the household debt from rising further.
All right, so these measures are good, but however, they must be carried out in a precautious way. That's what you're saying. All right, Dr. Lee Sang-bin, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Okay, thank you.
And that is your business today on this Friday. Thank you for watching. Do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.